Welcome everyone to our third webinar as part of our annual symposium. Really appreciate all of you joining us today, as well as the folks that are watching now on Facebook, but also the folks who will be watching us later on. Again, this webinar specifically is going to focus on research and campaigns focused on LGBTQ people and employment. The reason for this is that the Institute wants to connect academics and activists. It's been one of our main goals over the course of our founding. And so for this year's symposium, we really wanted to dive into the intersections of research, but also campaigns. And so today we have a really great panel of folks who are going to share some thoughts with you. I'd like to introduce them now. We have Chris Lugo, Executive Director of the Out Georgia Business Alliance. Thank you, Chris, for joining us today. We have Gabrielle Claiborne, co-founder and CEO of Transformation Journeys Worldwide. Thank you, Gabrielle, for being here. And we also have Dr. Franco Dispenza, Associate Professor of Rehabilitation Counseling and Counselor Education at Georgia State University, and is also a licensed psychologist here in Georgia. Dr. Franco, thank you so much for being here. And of course, we have Ashley Rabus, who's our LGBTQ Institute Fellow, also a doctoral student in the Counselor and Education and Practice program at GSU. Ashley, thank you so much for being willing to moderate. And let's begin the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan, for that introduction. So as Ryan stated, thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited to dig into this topic and hopefully help to educate and facilitate dialogue amongst our community and beyond. So I wanted to before we get started, I wanted to invite the audience to, if you are here with us in Zoom, feel free to utilize the Q&A feature. If we have time at the end, we will draw upon our audience if you have any specific questions for one of our panelists and individually, or if you have a more general question that might apply to all of them, please do share that. We like to hear from you all. So to get us started, I wanted to ask a general question. So in no particular order, for our panelists, we know that the pandemic has really shifted the way that we all work. For some folks, that means that, folks have lost work or had to shift careers, or it's been a really hectic time for a lot of people with regard to employment. And I'm curious as to, from your perspectives, how has the pandemic affected LGBTQ people with regard to employment? So what have you seen?
So I guess I'll jump in and kick the conversation off. I feel like the pandemic has been kind of a bittersweet impact on the community. From one perspective, it's created a lot of barriers for the community. A barrier could include, access to healthcare. This is especially true for TGNC MB folks who may be looking for affirmative health care for hormone therapy or any kind of gender affirming procedures that they're looking to pursue. And, with hospitals at their max, a lot of those life-giving procedures have put on hold, and that has put a big strain on the TGNC MB community. And of course, we've all struggled with our mental health and making sure that we're doing the right things to position ourselves to take care of ourselves first in order for us to show up in our full capacity in the workplace. Some individuals are sheltering in place or have been sheltering in place with family members who are not necessarily supportive. So consequently, many of the community members have had to navigate that additional dynamic, working from a home or working from a space that they perhaps couldn't show up authentically because they perhaps have not come out to their family. But on the flip side of that, the pandemic has been an invitation, kind of like an invitation pause, if you will, for some individuals to say, okay, this is my opportunity to step into my authenticity as an LGBTQ individual. And so, when we're on these Zoom calls, these team calls, we're seeing more and more individuals show up that, okay, I'm not recognizing this individual. And, someone may have they, them, and their as their pronouns, recognizing folks for who they are based on how they're showing up authentically is very important. But this has been an opportunity for members of our community to take advantage of this pause and say, I'm going to lean more into my authenticity.
Adding to what Gabrielle so eloquently put, I would say, through the pandemic, the last, 17, 18 months or so, we also, of course, were moving parallel with the social justice movement. And I think this time that we had out of the office, in our own homes, understanding what we were capable of in a different environment, while also having this intense spotlight on inequities that we see not only in the LGBTQ plus community specifically, but across our broad communities, and specifically our communities of color here over, it's obviously been going on for so long. This is systemic, but I think this gave us an opportunity to really shine a bright spotlight on those inequities, as well as to have these bold conversations and information sharing about those inequities and how we can, as a society, work to address those challenges, and specifically how individual employers or employees can perhaps affect change within their own organizations. And I think, what I've learned over the past, 18 months or so is that we have that power as an employee, as a member of an organization, to demand change and to say it is not enough for us to simply have a blanket policy that is addressing discrimination. It is now the expectation that we are showing up authentically as ourselves. We are bringing everything we can about ourselves to work so that we can perform at the highest level, but that also means a higher level and demand of respect, of respecting our humanity, our individual health and mental health, and also those expectations that our employers are activating their voice, not only internally for the protection and advancement of their people, their customers, their vendors, but also to really flex their economic position and power to affect change externally in our communities. And I think employees are going to their employers and have that expectation that they may be taking a stance on a particular policy to support a particular community, perhaps, but it is no longer acceptable for individuals, leaders, and organizations, for that matter, to stand by idly while there is so much that is affecting the community at large, but specifically the LGBTQ plus community. So I think this was an opportunity for us to really look at some of those challenges that we may be facing or acknowledging in our community and say, what are we going to do about it? And actually, there are some steps that we can take in our own organizations to advance change.
Thanks, Chris. Definitely, there is no shortage of limitations and or potential opportunities that the pandemic has provided. I think there are many organizations, including academia, including clinical health settings, that it really is a day-by-day basis, sometimes having to make these quick decisions and having to make changes as quickly as possible in order to advance some of the current developments that are happening. I guess when I think about this question and thinking about some of the psychological pieces of this, what's been coming up in the research arena, what psychologists and counselors, as well as other social scientists have been studying, but then also what I'm getting from colleagues in clinical practice that are out in the communities, it seems to be the two primary things that continue to come up thematically is, of course, the stressors of associated with financial stability. Right? How do we make sure that we're able to get the resources that we need financially as well as health-wise? But then there's also that work-life interface piece. And so one of the things that came out of the Williams Institute earlier this year when they were looking at the impact of COVID-19 on employment, specifically on LGBTQ folks, was they definitely saw major discrepancies in terms of people who were losing their jobs, as well as people who were being furloughed. So it was higher among LGBTQ identified folks. But then when we begin to disaggregate some of that data, we also see some racial disparities. BIPOC folks were definitely actually losing their jobs at much higher rates compared to white LGBTQ folks. So we know that that's a significant concern when it comes to employment. Also, less ability to pay for mortgage and rent and to pay for household goods. That was something that was coming up out of the data. So we know that even just some basic essential necessities to day-to-day living, that was some serious impact that the pandemic has had. In terms of that work-life interface, which is kind of maybe a fancier term to talk about how our personal lives intersect with family and leisure and health in the workplace, what we saw were a lot of people having to make new workspaces in their homes. Some of us were still able to go into the office and work out of the office, but to that effect, it also meant exposing people that we worked with to our homes and to that aspect of our lives that were not always public, right? Some people did not disclose aspects of their personal life or just kept it more private depending on the work settings that they were in, or just never had to talk about it, or only had a few folks that they talked about in the workplace. And so it's interesting because now, as many of us have all done a lot of Zoom calls, our partners are coming in with our cups of coffees, our children are coming in with homework assignments and things like that. So this is exposing ourselves and our aspects of our private life and personal life that are really important to us to the workspace that was never perhaps exposed before. And so this, of course, brings up issues around stress, around disclosing, around comfort in the workplace, about our authenticity and about being our authentic self. But it also means potentially having some conversations, which also opens us up to some microaggressions in the workplace when we think about that psychologically. So that's probably the only other thing I could probably add to Gabrielle and Chris's part, but I really do love the authenticity part because it's definitely very much coming up in conversations in the research piece as well as in the clinical piece.
Absolutely. And I'm happy that you mentioned that, Dr. Dispenza, because as I was listening to each of the three of you, that was something that kind of rose to the top of my mind, was that you all said the word authenticity, authentically living authentic, and it's something along those lines, and kind of related it to what you were sharing based on your observations. So I want to hold on to that bit, and I want to kind of transition into asking you questions like individually. So I think I'll stick with you, Dr. Dispenza, since we're kind of on this psychological mental health kick, and I think that's really important. We know that your clinical work, your social justice work, your research interests, all those things are related to sexual and gender minority populations, persons living with chronic illnesses and disabilities, and also the career development piece and counselor education, psychologist training, all those things. And I think it's unique that what we're talking about today really intersects with every area of your expertise. So I was wondering if you can speak a little bit more about your thoughts on the connection between all these areas. So
Sure.
the COVID-19 pandemic, anti-trans efforts, business, like how all these things relate. And you can kind of provide us with like a current perspective on what the climate, what the playground looks like for employment.
So probably if I had to identify three particular areas, or rather how these areas are intersecting, and kind of bringing back Gabrielle and what Chris were also leading us in with, mental health is definitely an issue, and it's definitely been on the rise, specifically when we're just looking at LGBTQ persons and communities. Stress, depression, anxiety, those have all risen, and the data is pretty clear that the anxiety and stress and depression were already high, but definitely the pandemic has increased it. And that means LGBTQ folks are coming into the workplace with more mental health issues, in addition to demands of their personal life and work life. So this definitely impacts climate in the workplace. It impacts productivity, responsiveness during communication. I mean, just think of a day-to-day interaction you have with colleagues in the workplace. If you're feeling more anxious or depressed or stressed out or some other concern that you may be having, it's going to come out in some sort of way in an interaction. And then you have colleagues wondering what's going on or what's happening, or you're being called into an office by your supervisor to talk about these things. And so one of the things that's really also come up is privacy, right? So because COVID is a health-related issue, we talk a lot about privacy when it comes to health and wanting to keep certain health aspects of ourselves or keep components of our health private. Gets a little bit harder to now do in the workplaces when there's a lot more tension. And that includes, of course, mental health as well as with physical health. But we also saw some severe disruptions during the beginning of the pandemic, particularly when it came to accessing mental health, behavioral health services. So Gabrielle, you mentioned that. And that was a big issue for a lot of mental health care providers because we had to get to a point where so much of our work happens in an office in a closed space. And so it wasn't safe, physically safe to continue that work. So a lot of clinicians had to move and jump ship to a telehealth piece and had to make sure that we were compliant with federal laws and state laws. And then also who had the competencies and the abilities to do it. So we know that there was some lag time there. And what was unfortunate about that event is that we already know that LGBTQ folks access mental health and behavioral health services at higher or increased rates compared to the rest of the population. So we know that when this pandemic happened, they were definitely going to be drastically impacted during that. Another really interesting thing is sleep quality. You know, a lot of us were joking about sleep, which is so important, right, to regular physical health, but we're joking about having more sleep. And some of the data actually did support that, but when we began to look even further, quality of sleep, though, actually went down because people were really anxious and stressed out about potentially getting sick, getting COVID. This was a fear that was actually very prevalent within the LGBT community when they were surveyed. So we know that this was a real fear because we have a history. We have a long transgenerational history of being traumatized when it comes to pandemics and health issues, particularly when we think about HIV and the AIDS crisis and how ingrained that is in our DNA culturally as a group. So this was very real for us. But then also, again, that financial stressor. There's the myth of what I refer to as gay affluence, right? Where people just assume that there's disposable income, but we know that's also not true. The data doesn't actually support that. We do not have tons of money coming out. I think the second part with that is the structural stigma that also, again, Gabrielle and Chris alluded to. And that's, you know, there are conditions that exist socially that constrain our opportunities and our capacity to have wellness and or access resources. And so we know that those disparities, I think, Chris, you were mentioning this, that those were really amplified during COVID. But we also know that that structural stigma also has a direct link to mental health, to behavioral health, to depression, anxiety, using substances. And so that definitely, I would say, has played a significant role in the way that I've been thinking about this and how these different areas intersect, both for the individual and in the workplace in particular.
Thank you so much for that perspective. That was really thorough. I'm partially taking notes so I can facilitate this discussion, but also partially for myself. This is really good stuff. Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to turn the spotlight over to you, Chris. I know that your work with LGBTQ owned and allied businesses have not been without challenges. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about what those challenges have been like during COVID, and also curious if I'm similar to Dr. Dispenza, if you've been into any data that maybe gives you hope about opportunities for LGBTQ owned businesses and things like that. So kind of what challenges there are, and like if you've been into any like positive, hopeful data.
Yeah, absolutely, Ashley. And you know, even just picking up on one last point from Dr. Franco is, you know, when it comes to privacy, I think another thing we experienced over, you know, through the pandemic was we had all these listening sessions, right, where you know, you had ERG, employee resource groups, or groups of employees within an organization that were, you know, encouraged to be vulnerable and to share what those challenges were. And I think, you know, part of the concern is, you know, we were in those moments where we were celebrating that vulnerability and authenticity, and and being able to share what those real challenges were. And if you fast forward several months, has that feedback, has there been anything that's materialized from that? Or were those just vulnerable moments that were knee-jerk reactions where we were saying, yeah, let's get the employees together so we can vent about challenges that our women are facing, or that BIPOC employees are facing, or LGBTQ employees are facing, and then what were the follow-ups from that? So to me, I start to think about privacy there. If you were spilling your guts about the challenges you face as an LGBTQ plus person internally in an organization that may not have that kind of representation throughout the organization, I think that could be a real challenge now as you're thinking about where you are continuing to go with your career as an employee. And kind of pivoting back over to Ashley to your questions around the challenges of LGBTQ plus business owners. Of course, I think there were, just like many business owners and small business owners in particular, LGBTQ plus biz folks, saw around a 50% reduction in their business from a revenue perspective throughout COVID. And this was based on a recent study over this past spring with CNBC and Acorns that partnered with the National LGBT Chamber to really look at some of that data nationwide. But those concerns were also kind of exacerbated by just systemic challenges when it comes to access to capital. Of course, we all were hearing so much about the Small Business Administration's EIDL loans and PPP, but LGBTQ small business owners had real trouble accessing PPP and EIDL funding throughout the pandemic, and especially if they didn't have access to formal business planning, consulting, or mentors in their own space, which is, again, very common for the LGBTQ plus business community not to have access to those type of resources. And then, that kind of trickles down to if we're experiencing the pandemic and really thinking about your business, have you done that business planning, that succession planning to be in a position to pivot? Those were all some real challenges faced by our community. But I think the hopefulness is that there are large numbers that are expecting, around 80% of those business owners are expecting to make a full recovery through 2022. Now, this was, surveyed as of this past spring and into early summer. Obviously, the Delta variant and the recent surge has caused some significant setbacks. And obviously, today's news was, the Atlanta Pride Festival, the largest Pride Festival here in the Southeast, is moving back or moving away from in-person events. But that's just another, example of just the challenging kind of ebb and flow that we're experiencing here through the pandemic. But I do feel like we are hopeful right now. We are hopeful, even though we're having these ups and downs, and we're trying to understand. I think that COVID taught us more to be on our toes and to be expecting that everything's not just going to go back to the way it was or normal. I don't think that exists anymore. I think for any business owner, and especially our LGBTQ plus business community, we've got to be nimble, we've got to be flexible. And I think the pandemic taught us that that is an important part of our business planning as we move forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Chris. So I feel like we're kind of going small and moving in the big direction. I know we heard from Dr. Dispenza with like an intrapersonal and interpersonal perspective on how the pandemic has impacted LGBTQ employment. And then we heard from Chris about small business owners and LGBTQ allied and owned businesses. And now I want to hear from you, Gabrielle. I know that you work with major corporations to help them learn how to be inclusive of trans employees and customers. And we've also seen how trans issues have been used to divide people, right? I know that I think in a recent article last week, it was reported that a Trump advisor stated, I think even with Christians, the gay issue, that ship has sailed, but the trans issue is different. And so given how businesses have the opportunity to lead, much like how they are with mask mandates and vaccination mandates, I just heard the news with Delta as well. How do you convince those businesses who might be reluctant to be public about their support? Like, how do you convince them of the value and the need of being public with that support? And is there any data that you turn to as well?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And, you know, I think all of us would hope that we would not have to convince an organization to really do the right thing. We just want the organizations to do the right thing, you know, and we want them to do the right thing because it's setting themselves up to be that elusive employer of choice for everybody, for the entire marketplace, right? But unfortunately, that is not the case with all of our clients, you know, and that's where we have to start having conversations around the business case reasons for why this conversation is relevant for you right now, not, you know, a year or 6 months from now. The conversation is relevant for right now. And some of those business case reasons are things like a 2017 Harris poll that revealed that 12% of millennials identify as some form of trans or gender nonconforming, and only 2% of those identify as trans. And there was a 2018 Pew Research report that indicated that while 25% millennials personally knew someone who used they, them, and theirs pronouns, 35% of Gen Zers personally know someone who uses they, them, and their pronouns. You know, we had a Supreme Court ruling last year that said that you cannot discriminate against an employee because of their sexual orientation, their gender identity, and their gender expression. And these are protected classes under Title VII now, right? And then to pour salt on the wound to attract and retain the best talent, especially in the challenges that we are seeing organizations have with the labor pool. It's very important for them to start having these conversations. And, you know, as they start having these conversations, they realize that things like the messaging that they're putting out to their community, you know, is their messaging relevant to an LGBTQ individual's personal lived experience? Are you putting verbiage in your website that includes sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression? And this is not just for your employees, but this is the diverse customer pool that you are now providing resources and products to, right? Making sure you're meeting those individuals where they are and to being the most competitive in the marketplace. And as a result, hopefully organizations realize that they have to start showing up in the places that we show up. They need to be a member of their local LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce, like the Out Georgia Business Alliance. They need to show up in their pride, local pride organization. They need to show up in the spaces that we live, because when we start seeing these organizations becoming present and visible in the spaces that we live, then we start standing up and taking notice and saying, okay, well, maybe I need to research this company a little bit to see if this is a company that could be a potential candidate for employment for me. So those are some of the things that organizations are starting to start processing and understanding how to navigate. I mean, even to the point of making sure that talent acquisition professionals are equipped with the strategies and the approach in order to be respectful with gender diverse job applicants, maybe making sure that they understand how to navigate an individual who doesn't have fully aligned legal documents. You know, how do you introduce yourself respectfully with your pronouns so that that person, that gender diverse applicant, is feeling like that they're feeling seen and heard in their interview process? You know, how do you deal with blemishes on an individual's record so that you're not immediately eliminating them from an opportunity that they could totally contribute to your organization? So it's these types of dynamics that organizations are starting to become aware of and leaning into. And some of the organizations that are collecting this data have already been referenced in Dr. Dispenza's and Chris's comments. The Williams Institute has some great data on lived experiences of LGBTQ individuals in the workplace. NCTE, the National Center for Trans Equality, they did a survey, the largest survey that's ever been done on the US trans community in 2015. A lot of good data is there. They're actually releasing an update to their survey next year in 2022. So you want to be on the lookout for that. GLAD does a lot of does some surveying, and the HRC. These are types of organizations that are advocating for our visibility and our well-being in the workplace.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Gabrielle. I think that a lot of what you shared, well, one, a lot of that resonated with me. Just this idea that we don't want to have to convince people that we are worthy and valuable in the workplace and that we deserve these things. Like, we just hope that it's automatically there. But a lot of our work is dedicated to that, unfortunately. I'm doing that kind of work. So that's a good segue into my next question, which is a general question for all three of you. So you shared with us about your specific work that you do from the lens of how, you know, COVID has impacted your work and what you see in your various professions. And so I'm curious about your opinions on what's next. So when it comes to LGBTQ research and campaigns, specifically regarding employment, what do you think is next? And then as a second piece of that, how do the recent court rulings and Biden's affirmation of LGBTQ people play a part in what you believe is next? So in no particular order.
Part of what I think is next is continuing, the direction that Gabrielle highlighted so well, and that is elevating and really valuing everyone for their humanity, their individuality, their background. We all know that queer, trans, BIPOC folks dominate how we shape our culture. Why not invest in those individuals and communities to ensure that you're bringing innovation to the table for your organization? And if you have a focus on that, let's not just get them in the door of your organization. Are you auditing your internal culture at your organization? Are you thinking about how you are advancing LGBTQ plus queer, trans, and BIPOC talent within your organization? Are you looking all the way up and down, left and right through the organization to understand representation and be intentional about a plan to start bringing in more of those dynamic and diverse voices into the room when it comes to your C-suite or every level of research and development, product development, marketing campaigns? Are you, because I think we all can sniff it out so easily right now when you see someone slap a rainbow label on a marketing campaign, or just kind of tap into that stereotypical set of colors, or if you see just a very few LGBTQ plus employees consistently represented, and that's it. I think those next steps are really taking this honest, deep evaluation of your organization, where you are. Be honest about where you are. And even if the answer isn't pretty or desirable, I think that honesty to your individual organizations is so important, to acknowledge where those shortcomings or those gaps may be. And then how are you going to tap into talent like trans-led consulting organizations, or voices that can come in, pay them for their time and work to then consult and guide how you're developing, and then gut check that along the way. I just think we, as a society, maybe as individuals, we get so used to, I'm going to take that training course for 30 minutes or an hour or a day, and I am good. I am so diverse, understanding our community, and boop, that's it. I've got the badge. But I've heard some recent comments on another podcast is, like, how do you spell love? It is time. It's TIME. This is going to be this ongoing process that it's never going to end either way. We're always going to have to continue to sharpen the saw and understand how we improve what we're doing. So I'll pause there. I'm just really, encouraged and hopeful that we can continue that trajectory of being thoughtful and diligent in our work.
Yeah, Chris, I appreciate you bringing up the concept of culture, because, a lot of our clients, they reach out to us and they're they're very intentional in wanting to collect the data. And don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. Collecting the data is paramount for our lived experience to be even measured, because right now, in many cases, it's not being measured. But unfortunately, a lot of these organizations want to put all these data collecting initiatives in place, but they're not wanting to do the work at the culture level first for these individuals to feel comfortable showing up authentically. So consequently, what they do is they launch these data collecting initiatives. They don't get any responses, and then that has a negative feedback on the intent of the initiative. They say, well, look, we don't have folks here. So the conversations that you're saying we should have, we don't need to have because it's not representative of our workplace demographic. But you see the negative feedback that happens here. So I think companies need to understand that they need to learn to get comfortable with being uncomfortable and to lean into the courageous conversations to allow folks that they're not seeing in their organization to find a way to create a culture, not a culture of safety so much, but a culture of belonging. We got to move from safety to belonging. And when companies start realizing the value of creating a culture of belonging, then the natural next step is collecting that data and allowing our experiences to be measured, because we all know what matters gets measured, and what should be mattering is, what does your workplace look like? And to your point, Chris, what are our gaps? Who are we missing? Who is not at the table that we need to provide a space for?
Gabrielle, as you were talking, there was the other part, the fearful part, right? Which is there were organizations that then collect data, but then don't use it, right? And I think that's even worse, right? Because that's maybe that sticker slap that Chris was maybe alluding to, like we're going to put up the front, or we're going to attempt to do this, but then we're not actually going to use the evidence to make changes and lean into that discomfort, right? And that also says a lot. So to kind of continue on what both of you were talking about and where my mind was going, and trying to answer Ashley's question as well. At this point, I feel that there's enough data to say that especially corporate organizations that have implemented supportive workplace policies, not necessarily the best, but they've implemented something, right? The data supports that. Guess what? There's increased financial profitability. There's more productivity out of employees, right? They're happier to be there. They're more well and healthy, which means they're coming to work, which means people want to be in that workplace. There are lower ratings of workplace harassment. People feel less isolated. So there's enough out there. And so I think one of the things that I'd like to see, especially given the Supreme Court's hearing from last year, because there's also some evidence that some people that have done some work that have looked at countries in terms of legislation, and when there's a national legislation that recognizes sexual minority folks, that recognizes trans and gender non-binary individuals, that there's also higher per capita domestic products and all that other fancy stuff that I'm not an economist, so I don't know these things as well, but I pay attention to them. We know that they're benefiting from this, right? And so I think what I'd like to see is more campaigns and maybe the study of those campaigns, and to kind of go back into this, right? How do we promote this so organizations could continue to actually take these strategies that have already been proven to be effective and implement them, and then get them to see the fruit of their labor, so to speak. And then, as a psychologist, of course, I'm also really interested in the health factors, right? And so when given the Supreme Court's legislation and given to see how this rolls out in states, are we going to see people healthier? Are we going to see lower rates of mental health issues, right? Of course, ideally, I would love to see that. I want to see all of that go down, and I want to see wellness and success and happiness go up. But I could be hopeful, right? And I'll continue to remain hopeful. But these are things that I'd like to see moving forward in terms of next directions, is the continuing studying, but also the implementation.
Ashley, if I can respond to the court ruling piece for just a minute. Yeah, thank you. I'm hoping that a lot of us are mindful and aware of all the the anti-trans legislation that is moving throughout our country, both at the local and at the national level. And you may be thinking about, why is anti-trans legislation, which is prohibiting trans people from competing in sports that aligns with their gender identity, or allowing trans people to pursue gender affirming health care, and penalizing them and the parents and the healthcare provider for doing these things. Well, as we move through these cases, organizations like Lambda Legal, ACLU, these organizations are doing wonderful work advocating on behalf of these anti-trans legislative issues. And as a result, it has a ripple effect on our workplace. It actually begins to start normalizing our experience as just another expression of the human experience. And consequently, not only can we show up at work authentically, but parents of trans children can show up authentically at work, and they can share with their colleagues, I have a trans child, and not blink twice and not think twice or blink, knowing that they have that. So it's these types of rulings that are advancing our culture's understanding and expansiveness of humanity, that we are all expressions of the human experience.
And even just taking the baton from Gabrielle and Dr. Franco, specific with the anti-trans legislation that we're seeing all over. We had multiple bills introduced here in Georgia. Thankfully, that didn't move on this year. We know those are going to come up again. We saw Tennessee, just to our north, enact the largest number of anti-trans bills, I think, in the nation. To me, I'm also picking up on what Gabrielle was mentioning about not only the individual trans students and their participation or access to trans affirming healthcare, but the parents and their employers. If their employers are not taking an active role in standing up to this anti-trans legislation and activating their voice, those parents may be looking for other employment with an organization that is trans affirming. And we know that when it comes to retention, and more specifically replacing employees, it is expensive. Here in Georgia, I know it's an estimated for an average employee, it's almost 10 grand to replace an employee. But if you're talking about, say, a parent or a senior level executive, it can be over $200,000 to go through that process of recruiting higher level folks. And I firmly believe, not only with the specific anti-trans legislation that we're seeing all over the place, but even when it comes to our federal legislation. So Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, of course, a year and some change ago, the Supreme Court affirmed that the protections extend to not only sexual orientation, but gender identity and expression. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964 applies to employers that have 15 or more employees. So if we're talking about small businesses, that's where we have to have action from a state perspective. And if we're not seeing that consistency, then we have this kind of patchwork of what is, legal or acceptable or not. And I think that's why it's so important that the individual states, and in here in Georgia, that we are continuing to push for consistent non-discrimination legislation, so that it's not dependent on which state you live in as to how authentic you can be, or how open you can be about your family or your kid or yourself in the workplace. So I think this legislative perspective from a federal and local and state level is so incredibly important to our community thriving. And if we want the next incredible badass CEOs and business entrepreneurs that are trans to stay in our state and add to the economy, we better back it up with policy.
Right on. Thank you all for those responses and for even adding on to them. I'm really, really loving this conversation. I know that we have kind of been on a very macro topic right now, and I want to stick with that. I wonder if you all consider the work that you do, if you consider it to be part of movement organizing. And I know that's like a yes or no question, but if you could explain like why or why not. So yeah, do you see your work as a part of movement organizing, and why or why not?
I would say I'll just jump in. So I serve as executive director of the Outdoor Business Alliance, and we're the only LGBTQ plus focused chamber of commerce here in the state of Georgia. There are several LGBTQ plus focused chambers across the United States, pushing 60 actually. And I think maybe in several years past, there was probably a view that we were in our economic lane and we focused on business, and we didn't step outside of that. But that's no longer acceptable today. Everything that we do from a business support perspective has a connection to healthcare, has a connection to one's livelihood, to their mental health, to housing, all those things. It is so incredibly connected. And well, maybe I wouldn't describe it as movement organizing, but I definitely think what we're doing is fully in the advocacy realm, because we know that when LGBTQ plus employees, businesses are thriving, so are their families, and by extension, their communities. And we are raising access to healthcare. We are increasing, generational wealth when it comes to our community, which we know has been lacking in that particular realm. But I think when it comes to supporting and advancing entrepreneurship and having an impact, big and small, on what's going on in the corporate world, that has a direct connection to livelihood. And I think our livelihood and our existence is interconnected across so many different fields and areas of focus. So I guess the short answer is yes. And I'll pass it to one of our partners here on the call.
So from my perspective, it is the work that we do is actually movement organizing, because I think what we've realized is that, to kind of Chris's point, when you're having a conversation around a person's lived experience, you go to the next person, you're going to hear a completely different story from their lens, right? So as a result, the conversations around the expansiveness and the importance and value of intersectionality is starting to emerge and come forth, right? And making sure that when you're having the conversations around advocacy and those types of things, that you make sure that you're elevating the right voices. It's not enough now just to have a white trans woman in the room. You need a Black or brown trans woman, or even a Black or brown trans man, or even a Black or brown non-binary individual, or the parent of. So, this conversation that we're having starts at a personal level, and it just goes out and it fans out as wide and diverse as all the multiple intersections of our community and our humanity show up. And the more that we start expanding the conversations to understand the width, breadth, and depth of how we show up as humanity, then we start realizing that, oh my goodness, we have more in common than not. And that's when we're going to be able to sit across the table from one another and have civil conversations with one another, and dispel this polarized culture that we're living in right now of this us and them. So from our perspective, it is a movement, but a movement of expansion and diversity and understanding. Just we're so diverse in how we show up as a community and as a world and as the world. So
if I could add just a little bit to that, and so what's resonating with me with what Chris and Gabrielle were sharing was this connection but expansion, right? Which puts into perspective that I think when I think about some of the work that I do, I'm operating in a lot of different systems. I'm in an ecological state, right, where I go from trying to organize and trying to help my professional community, whether it's the professional practice guidelines and how to work affirmatively and ethically with LGBT individuals, and in taking the best available science and evidence that supports this, in terms of making sure that psychologists and counselor educators are being affirmative, or can affirm, are capable of affirming, and really take into some of these larger abstract ideas that we talk in the academy and academia, but also really break it down, what it means, what it actually looks like and feels like. And that can be hard to do, because part of the other work I then do is within the community. So here I am trying to think about these issues and think about these ideas, but then trying to translate it into what it looks like on the ground. How can I communicate it in a particular way that it can be absorbed and accessible, right? My other background, of course, is in the area of disability, right? So I'm always thinking about accessibility. I'm always thinking about how to, for example, some work that I've done is around HIV and AIDS prevention for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, right? How do we make sure that individuals have access to these types of resources, especially when we're thinking about reading levels that are at the 3rd grade level, right? So these are constant challenges. So I think to do this type of organizational work and to try to move an organization is to be challenged, not to shy away from challenge. But I think one of the things that you really highlighted is the importance of kind of leaning in, right, and really embracing this and being vulnerable enough to be uncomfortable. But then also, Chris, when you mentioned having that energy, right, making sure that there's an energy behind it, right, to keep that motivation going, I think is really important. So anyway, so this is just to say that definitely resonates with me. This is how I attempt to do some of the work that I do. Of course, there's also the research side of the work, and trying to understand from the ground what's actually happening, so we can continue to understand these issues, so we can try to eliminate the disparities, we can try to eliminate the inequities, but we never do it perfectly, right? There's no such thing as perfect research, but the important thing is that we keep trying.
And as you were, Dr. Franco, talking about access, and obviously, touching in on our disability community, I think access to, movement organizing or access to advocacy can seem like this big barrier. Advocacy can seem like this big old thing that I may not be able to see myself in as an individual, or maybe a small business owner. And that's what I think is really powerful when it comes to the LGBTQ+ business community in particular is, yes, you can see the large corporations taking a stance, issuing press releases, showing up at events to voice their opposition, et cetera, investing in campaigns. But it's also another thing to see a solo entrepreneur better understand how they can flex their advocacy muscle with regard to their business, or a small shop that may just have a handful of employees where maybe they are queer owned and they don't feel like they need the policies, but by using their voice in their own community, or maybe even just being visible as a trans business owner, that visibility is so damn powerful, especially when we think about individuals and small businesses and thinking about access to advocacy. Let's start to work at chipping away at those perceived or real barriers there. So I think the access piece is incredibly important.
And I love that you bring up the concept of visibility, Chris, because I believe as human beings, that is one of all of our superpowers, visibility, because visibility expands our awareness and it opens up the door of, I didn't know what I didn't know. And until I start seeing someone either with my lived experience or someone with a different lived experience from mine, am I not informed? So I think visibility is important to the movement, regardless if you are an individual or if you're a corporation or spiritual community, it doesn't matter. Visibility is huge.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for those responses. I'm hoping that our audience is getting as much out of this conversation as I am. I did want to close with one question that we received privately from one of our audience members, and I think they have left the call, so hopefully they can watch the recording back and actually hear your responses to their question. But they've said, Great seeing us virtually. I value your feedback on these subjects today. And the participant says, my group is 100% virtual and we're trying to seek more innovative ways to interact without burnout in this space. We're using virtual meetings for our Pride, employee resource group, and wellness activities. Any other ideas? So any ideas for reducing and preventing burnout in virtual workspace for LGBTQ folks?
Go ahead, Chris.
No, I was just going to say that is a tough one. I kind of, I start to wonder about, maybe who's kind of having the torch. Maybe you're still utilizing the same types of tools and methods, but maybe you're kind of having the leader torch for a particular session or a gathering, kind of move around the room, if you will, to kind of look at how you tap into and better understand the group that you have, maybe right underneath your digital virtual nose, if that's not safe. But maybe you're leaning on other folks within your group to take some leadership and be thoughtful about how they would like to lead a particular session. Or maybe you're tapping into them to understand what are the topics and areas of focus that you'd like to explore here in the months ahead. Is there something, are there other organizations that are leading virtual events? If you have to keep to all virtual and you're not going in person, is there another organization that is leading something that you can dip into as an individual or a representative from your organization? And maybe you can take some things back and present that back to the group, or kind of share some things that were interesting that you found from another organization. So I don't think, at least from my perspective, I'm not sure if there's like a silver bullet here, because I think there, a digital virtual Zoom fatigue is absolutely real. I think you need to probably listen to your own folks and be able to get some feedback and say, hey, is a 4-hour meeting too much? Yes, it's too much. But maybe you can encourage them to explore some other organizations. You can tap into their own feedback and thoughts on how maybe they want to switch it up and take some different approaches to maybe those type of meetings, if it's an employee resource group or otherwise. So I'll pause there. Maybe my other colleagues here have some other suggestions.
I just have a minor one, and it's slightly theoretical and slightly empirical, if that makes any sense. Hide the self-view option when you're on Zoom. For a couple of reasons, right? I think there was actually some research that looked at to this, and actually looking at yourself does exhaust you more on Zoom, right? And they've done this and they've looked at it, and it's true. I feel less exhausted when I don't have a self-view. But when I think about the LGBTQ community and I think about stigma and I think about some of the psychological impact, a lot of us survived a lot of bad environments by making sure we always knew what we looked like in social spaces, right? We dress a certain way, we act a certain way, we perform a certain way. That's all because we need to survive some of these spaces. Right? And so whether it's the way that we express ourselves or dress or look. And so I think what ends up happening is that within the LGBT community, we already have a hypervigilance to what we look like. And then having a self-view option on Zoom only amplifies that a little bit more. So this is just one of those little psychological things that I've been thinking about that makes sense to me based on the data. And the data does show that if you remove that, you actually feel less fatigue, which I think is a good thing, if that's what we're aiming for. I'm not sure if that's really answering the question that the person had, but at least I can impart that a little bit.
And I'll also comment that, if the pandemic has taught us anything, is how to get creative to where we can try to maximize engagement with our employees and colleagues and customers. And one of the things that I feel is kind of like a win-win for your organization as well as an LGBTQ organization, because a lot of LGBTQ organizations have really been hit hard by the pandemic, as we've already talked about. So what is what could an engagement look like? Well, for example of what that could look like is the Outfront Theater, which is the only queer theater here in Atlanta in the state of Georgia. They actually are providing live performances. So a lot of our LGBTQ, ERG, and BRGs are actually learning that they could engage their entire group in a live performance to get creative, and they're giving back to the community in the process. So get creative. I love Dr. Dispenza's recommendation about hide the Selfview. I don't know if I could ever do that, but I may try. I may have to try to do that. But yeah, just get creative and listen to your people. I love that perspective, Chris.
Awesome. Thank you all for those suggestions. Ryan, I saw you unmuted yourself. Did you want to jump in?
No, I'm good. I'm good.
Okay. So before we wrap up, I wanted to invite each of our panelists to share any parting thoughts or advice that you might have for practitioners, funders, activists, academics. What advice do you have? And I'm looking at the time here. I know folks might have to log off at 4. So if you could package it up really nicely into a sentence or two, what might be your parting advice?
So I'll leave the group with this. You know, when we talk about authenticity, this is not just related to an individual, but it's also related to an organization. So organizations need to understand their why and lean into their authenticity so that they can show up authentically. And then that way they win, the employee wins, the customer wins, and everybody is successful.
I'll share, just like the American Disabilities Act has improved the lives of more than just those who are living with disability, treating and understanding and elevating your LGBTQ plus employees is not going to just improve their experience. It is going to improve the experience for the entire organization and more folks that fall outside of the LGBTQ plus community.
Don't know if I could really follow up on that one, but there's data out there. I think there is support for some practices that are rooted in evidence that could really help support organizations that are trying to help with the employment piece, and academics and researchers. We want to be helpful, and we want to be able to provide resources when we can, because we do have a goal of wanting to make society better as best as we possibly can.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for those parting thoughts. And again, thank you so much for being here. A special thank you to our attendees who tuned in. And I want to pass it over to Ryan at this time. I know that he's got some closing words.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you again to the panelists and to, again, like Ashley said, the viewers. I've learned a lot. I've been taking lots of notes. I do want to just remind folks that we are looking at our next session. But before I mention that date, I wanted to also mention that we have our LGBTQ Southern Survey online right now. You can go to that website and tell us your story. A lot of what we learned today was about storytelling and being authentic. This is a great way for us to know about what it's like to be LGBTQ in the South. So please take a look at that survey, fill it out. And if you have, encourage your friends and family who are LGBTQ here in the South to participate as well. Our next session will be on research and campaigns focused on LGBTQ people, specifically around health and well-being. That'll be on September 15th at 3 p.m. You can see our social channels there on ways to register. But wanted to say thank you again to our panelists, thank you to our audience, and hopefully we'll see you next month. Thank you so much.